Peterson and others seek to replace this oppressor versus oppressed conceptualization of capitalism with the far more positive and, more importantly, motivating self-made man narrative.
If you were reasonably successful in Grand Prairie, the probability that you had inherited your money from the aristocracy was like zero, because there wasn't one, right? The whole damn town was 50 years old. So if you had any influence or wealth, you were a small businessman, small to middle-sized businessman, and you knew what you were doing. And I actually admired these people.
The guy talks about the self-made man, but most rich people are rich because of inheritance or because their family was already very powerful. You just need to look back at the place capitalism was born, Europe. The families that were rich in Florence in the 1400s are still the richest even to this day. Capitalism just doesn't make poor people richer. It just makes rich people even more rich. Just look at Donald Trump. He was never poor. His father gave him $1 million to start his own business, and he is a billionaire now. You rarely see poor people becoming rich.
It's pretty funny he says that he finds the self-made man narrative more motivating than the idea that you're being exploited. Well, maybe so, but it's just not true. Should we just start believing in fantasies just to make ourselves feel better? Oh yes, I'm not being exploited. I'm not being exploited. I'm going to be a self-made man one day. It's like the man who just spends every week fantasizing about how he's gonna win the lottery and then what he's gonna do with all the money once he wins the lottery. And of course he never fucking wins it, you know? You are being exploited if you work for somebody else and they get all the things you make and they just give you a measly little wage, then they're exploiting you. That's the only reason they're hiring you. They're not doing it for charity. And just like Heitor said, it's extremely rare for somebody to just start from scratch and then become a billionaire. That practically never happens. And even when it does happen, it's more like winning the lottery than anything else. Yeah, some extremely rare individuals do win the lottery, but it's not really a viable systemic or ideological solution to just say, oh, let's just all become lottery winners. Well, it's just not gonna work. Most small businesses go bankrupt, and most people who have small businesses work really hard and they're all poor.
You just need to look at the 2008 crisis to see what happened to all those small businesses.
Yeah, we don't have a problem with small businesses. Those are hard-working people. They're petty bourgeois or even semi-proletarian. They're not even capitalist. Then he gives the tired libertarian talking point that supposedly the poor and the working class are all just envious of the success of the rich. And maybe to somebody with a very middle-class mindset this might seem like a reasonable argument, but it's actually entirely ridiculous. Because if you look at all the great revolutions and great social movements of history, you see people making concrete demands because they want to improve their own lives. It's really as simple as that. It happens because people's lives are just so bad. Their lives are unbearable. And a situation occurs where they see some kind of opportunity to better their own lives. Look at the demands that people have now. They want affordable housing because they don't want to be homeless. They want access to healthcare because they don't want to die or to go into debt. They want affordable education. They want jobs. They want peace instead of war. They want democracy instead of capitalist oligarchy. Really, only somebody who's out of touch can say that these people are just envious. Even if you look at the Russian Communist Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, look at their demands. They said peace, bread, and land. Those were the big things that everybody wanted. Capitalism just has failed these people. These demands that people have are typically very basic, as I said. Affordable housing, education, healthcare, and jobs. And it's a pretty pitiful system that can't even provide people with that.
I mean, no wonder young people are going more and more to socialism. It's just literally becoming impossible to live under capitalism. Economic conditions are not favorable for people to actually live in. Have you ever paid your own rent before? Have you ever seen how much a hospital bill costs? Students are up their ass in loans because they just want the basic education that they need to get a good job.
Then these right-wingers come along and they make excuses for capitalism. They're like, oh, the poor people are just stupid and lazy, and Mr. Moneybags over here really deserves all the money he has. Well, no, he actually doesn't. If some capitalist earns 1,000 times more than me, for instance, from just sitting on his ass and collecting interest and collecting profits from his investments, is he working 1,000 times harder than I am? No, he's not. Is he producing 1,000 times more? No. Capitalists who just have investments, they don't even work. They don't contribute anything. They just collect money from investments.
You don't get to be a postmodernist and a Marxist. You actually technically cannot be both of those things at the same time. And the fact that most people are both of those things at the same time raises the specter of just exactly what their motivation is. And then I would say it's this resentment-driven anti-capitalism.
So, Heitor, since we're both Marxists, when's the last time you've even met a postmodernist Marxist?
Never.
Yeah, me neither. I've actually never met one.
Peterson said something that is actually true. You can't be a postmodernist and a Marxist, but there is a problem. He doesn't know what both of those things are. Wanna know why? Because he never read about it. The only two books he ever read and bases his thesis on are the Gulag Archipelago and the Black Book of Communism, two extremely great sources and totally unbiased, I must say myself.
The ridiculous thing is, like, yeah, he says you can't be a postmodernist and a Marxist, but he's the one who always claims that we are postmodernists. Like, he just shits on Marxist postmodernism constantly. We're not postmodernists. He's the one who always claims we are.
You don't get to be a postmodernist and a Marxist. And the fact that most people are both of those things at the same time.
Now, throughout Professor Wolf's video, he seems to be arguing for equality of outcome.
He's not. So don't even worry about that. He's not advocating for equality of outcome.
Professor Wolf claims,
however, Marxism exists in every country on the face of the earth. It's been going on for 150 years, and a lot more than what happened in Russia under Stalin over a period of 15 or 20 years has to be taken into account if you're going to make an assessment of Marxism.
But he's never really clear about what he means here. Is he talking about progressive taxation? Is he talking about a social safety net?
Richard Wolff was very vague. He has a pretty bad interpretation of what socialism is, but he isn't wrong in the regards that capitalist countries have to implement left-wing policies to survive crises. Do you really think that Western Europe wouldn't have become socialist if they didn't become a welfare state? Europe was completely destroyed after World War II. The only governments trying to rebuild themselves with their own strengths were the Eastern Bloc countries, which paid for education, healthcare, housing. Western Europe had to adapt itself to this new economic model or be absorbed in unrest over people not having basic necessities.
Then he claims that capitalism provides an equality of opportunity, but that's just laughable. We were already talking about people like Donald Trump. He gets a shit ton of money from his family to start all his businesses, most of which he squanders and whatnot. Look at all the big banks who destroyed the global economy in the 2008 capitalist financial collapse. They all just get bailed out. And if you look at poor people, look at people in most of the world, Africa, East Asia, India, South America. Those people have much less opportunities. If you're born in some poor capitalist shithole, then you have very few opportunities. They try to eke out a miserable existence and maybe save enough money to move to the West or something. Clearly there is no equality of opportunity. That's just laughable.
Jordan Peterson very much understands the difficulties of income inequality.
As soon as you set up a domain of production, and you need to because you need things to be produced, then you instantly produce a competition, and the spoils go disproportionately to a tiny percentage of people. Well, so what? Well, so the rest of the people starve, or the system becomes unstable because everybody's mad. It's like, that's a big problem. Okay, so how do human beings fix that? Well, the first thing we did was diversify the number of productive games.
This is one of the biggest advantages that first world economies have over third world economies, where they don't have a diverse set of vocations that each person can strive to achieve in. If you are stuck in an economy with few paths to success, you are forced to compete that much harder in each of those paths.
Jordan Peterson talks about how the Third World doesn't have a diverse economy, but the West doesn't have anything. The West survived by moving all of its industries to the Third World. If you move all the industries Western countries have back to their homeland, you wouldn't have something different from what Third World countries have today, because these industries need low-wage workers for higher profits. People talk about how Western countries have a diverse economy, but all the West did was just move all of its hard industry to the Third World.
I get to use fancy words for once, so there exists a dialectical, that is, a two-way relationship between the First World and the Third World. The West, which has all the money, and then the rest of the world, where Western corporations run everything.
80% of the world's people barely have any wealth. It's hard to even see them on the chart. Meanwhile, the richest 2%, they have more wealth than half of the rest of the world. Let's look at this chart another way. Let's take the whole world's population, all 7 billion of us, and reduce it to just a representative 100 individuals. Here they are, poorest people on the left, richest people on the right. Now let's show how the world's total wealth, roughly $223 trillion, is distributed. The vast majority have practically nothing. Nothing with which to educate their children, nothing with which to pay for basic medicines. While the richest 1%, they've accumulated 43% of our world's wealth.
What Marx observed was that capital tended to accumulate in the hands of fewer and fewer people. And he said that's a flaw of the capitalist system. That's wrong. It's not a flaw of the capitalist system.
The bottom 80%, meanwhile, that's 8 out of every 10 people, have just 6% between them. But even this doesn't really show how extreme things have become. The richest 300 people on Earth have the same wealth as the poorest 3 billion. So the number of people it takes to fill a mid-sized commercial aircraft have more wealth than the populations of India, China, the US, and Brazil combined. We can also see this difference geographically, with a huge and growing gap between a few rich places versus the majority of the world. For most of history, things were much more equal. 200 years ago, rich countries were only 3 times richer than poor countries. By the end of colonialism in the 1960s, they were 35 times richer. Today, they're about 80 times richer. Rich countries try to compensate for this by giving aid to poor countries, about $130 billion each year. That's a lot of money. So then why does the wealth gap keep getting bigger? One reason I found is that large corporations are taking more than $900 billion out of poor countries each year through a form of tax avoidance called trade mispricing. On top of this, each year poor countries are paying about $600 billion in debt service to rich countries on loans that have already been paid off many times over. And then there's the money that poor countries lose from trade rules imposed by rich countries to get access to more resources and cheaper labor. Economists from the University of Massachusetts calculate that this costs poor countries about $500 billion a year. Altogether, that's more than $2 trillion that flows from some of the poorest parts of the world to the richest. Every year. Rich governments like to say they're helping poor countries develop. But who's developing who here? This makes me think that there's something wrong with the basic rules of the global economy.
It's not that those places are just randomly bad or that the people in those places are somehow worse, even though that is the propaganda that they try to tell you. No, it's for historical reasons. If you look into the history of why exactly Africa is poor, why South America is poor compared to the US, and what exactly is the relationship between the West and Asia, South America, Africa, you will pretty quickly start to see that it's for historical reasons that some places in the world are poor and some places in the world are rich. There probably isn't a single South American country that the US hasn't militarily or otherwise intervened in. Same with the Middle East. There probably isn't a single country in the Middle East that the West hasn't either outright set up as its puppet or somehow militarily invaded, intervened, or destabilized. All the governments and all the states in these regions are like less than 100 years old. They've gotten their independence from outright colonialism in like the 50s, 60s, 70s. And ever since that happened, ever since they got their nominal independence, The Western corporations have still controlled their economies, and the Western governments have still continued to dictate what these countries are supposed to do if they don't want to be constantly harassed and constantly bullied by the West. And I'm not trying to go on some big rant about how much I hate the West or something. It has nothing to do with the culture of the West or the people of the West or the people of Third World versus the people of First World. It's just capitalism. The Western corporations just happen to be the big corporations who control everything, and it's within their profit motive and within their interest to dominate the rest of the world. It's just capitalism. And it's a problem.
So Marx pointed to a fundamental issue. But he said, well, that's a fault with capitalism. It's like, no, it isn't. It's something way more pernicious than that. And it's something like, well, when one good thing happens to you, it makes you a little more powerful and attractive. And so that fractionally increases the possibility that another good thing will happen to you.
Peterson gives a pretty odd argument. It's really idealist of him to think that, if something good happens, another good thing is going to happen.
And we don't know what to do about that.
So sure, we don't know how to deal with it.
Maybe you don't, but we do.
But lucky for us, Professor Wolf has a plan. He has a plan to deal with this problem.
What's the alternative? I already told you at the beginning of this little monologue. That's when the people who produce the surplus, the workers, are themselves the people who get the surplus. How would that work?
Insert his usual co-op bullshit. Move on.
Bedmouse made a pretty good video talking about this question a few years ago. The whole thing about co-ops is that they're not made to compete. They're made to make the workers' livelihood inside said business better. That is why most co-ops are small shops and not big corporations. This makes them economically unviable to compete with other businesses because of how they are supposed to function.
We don't really agree with Richard Wolff's co-op argument here, for a number of reasons. To another communist, I would say that co-ops can't really be the end goal. They're just one step along the way. They don't really take us to communism yet.
Monday to Thursday, where all the workers come to work and do what they were always doing. Friday, sit around making the decisions.
I think he's just dumbing things down a bit too much, either to make it simple or to sell this idea to people better, or I don't really know why, but he wants to push this idea of direct workplace democracy, which is all fine and good. I don't really have a problem with it in principle, but I don't think something like that is really the way to go. In a fairly small individual company, yeah, you can do that, but if you have a really big workplace, and especially if you have a whole country of these things, where you try to have a planned economy, then you need to have a nationwide plan with some kind of structure and hierarchy. You can't just have every company deciding every Friday what they're gonna do or something. No, there's other industries relying on them, there's whole vast projects that are outside of their own little company, so it all sounds too decentralized to me. Furthermore, he's confusing what a boss is and what a capitalist is. Typically in your average workplace, average big company, the capitalist never shows up. He's not there. He's not the guy at your workplace who's ordering you to do stuff. No, he's somewhere entirely different. The capitalists, they're the investors. They're the owners. You don't get to meet them at your workplace. Your direct superior, or even their superior, those people are not the capitalists. They're directors, managers, foremen, team leaders, what have you. They're not the bad guys. They're just other people who work there and try to organize things. And I don't think we should be pushing this no bosses attitude. Like I said, I'm all for workplace democracy, but this kind of idea I don't really know. Maybe this is what Richard Wolff is advocating, but he's been a big fan of the Mondragon company, which is a big cooperative. And I believe the way they work is they just hire a CEO or something to manage the company. And I know a bunch of anarchists and a bunch of other people like that have said that it might make sense to have some kind of manager or CEO if the workers just elect him, or have a board of directors if the workers just elect them. Which, to me, sounds a lot more reasonable. In fact, that is what the Soviet Union did as well. They had directors and managers, but the trade unions could vote them out. So that was it.
This video was quite an experience to respond to.
Yeah, it was quite something. Thanks, comrades, for watching, and I'll see you next time.